Hey everyone, welcome back to another Ask GN episode. As always, you can leave your questions for next time in the comment section below. And we also are doing a part 2 of this video. So there's a two-parter this week. This is the main one. We'll have sort of an after hours or extras Ask GN segment that is going live for Patreon backers only. And we'll be publishing that on the Patreon page. So keep an eye out for that one. We're going to film it right after this. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake and the View 71 enclosure. The View 71 is a full tower case that's capable of fitting 3 video cards in most configurations. It's also one of the better cooling cases in our recent case testing bench lineup. The View 71 has hinged tempered glass doors on either side that make it easy to open and show off, and it comes with at least one rain fan, though you can get the RGB version if you prefer. Learn more at the link in the description below. I wanted to start this one off with just a quick news item on GDDR6 because it'll probably be a day or two before we do our next news video, and this is kind of noteworthy. So before we get into the questions, GDDR6 has had some news lately. The newest bit of info is from SK Hynix, who are noting that their GDDR6 chips are available for purchase now from the partners who buy them to make stuff. So they're selling the memory modules at 10, 12, and 14 gigabits per second. This is a bit slower than the modules that Samsung has talked about. However, Samsung's aren't available yet, and they were still pre-production when they last spoke of them. I think Samsung was indicating maybe as high as 16 to 18 gigabits per second for its speeds, whereas Hynix is capping out at 14 here. And other than that, the speeds or the bandwidth respectively would be 40 gigabytes, 48 gigabytes, and 56 gigabytes per second for the Hynix modules at 10, 12, and 14 gigabits per second. So that's kind of what we got for now. Voltages are 1.25 or 1.35 depending on what it is. And we'll talk about this more in a news item sometime soon. But wanted to put that out there because it's kind of interesting news and it has implications for the GPU market. We already know that new GPUs are coming sometime this year. So that sort of, I don't know, we'll see if they actually end up on the cards or if that's next generation. But either way, they will be ready for purchase by manufacturers. So first question for this one was pretty interesting. This is from YouTube commenter Ben Grogan, who said, OpenFan GPU heatsinks run their fin arrays transverse on the card. Is there a reason why this is the case beyond longer heat pipe runs? Would there be any benefit to longitudinal fins which would allow the case front fans to encourage front to back airflow? So as I understand it, the question is basically, this is convenient, question's basically why are these fins running up, down versus left, right? And I talked to a few people about this, including VSG from Thermal Bench, and I think our answers all pretty much align, which is it's the same idea as for radiators for liquid cooling, where in this case, you're trying to expose as much of the primary heat transfer, heat dissipation element as possible. And in the case of an air-cooled heatsink as opposed to liquid, really what's doing most of your work is those heat pipes. So these heat pipes, in this instance, are all running left to right, and that layout allows the heat pipes to be as long as they can be. Going top to bottom, they're going to be shorter. Left to right, if you did the horizontal fin layout, you wouldn't get as much contact to the heat pipes, and that's kind of, from what I understand, a bit less of a concern than just the heat pipe run length in general. And to catch everyone up, I'm sure most of you know this at this point, but heat pipes do a phase change. So that's why they're so effective at cooling. There's basically a liquid in there. We've talked about its composition in the past in content pieces. But there's a liquid in the heat pipe. When it gets over the GPU in this instance, heats up, turns into a gas. So that's a phase change. Goes to the other end of the pipe, cools down, condenses, uses capillary action to come back down the heat pipe as a liquid, where it repeats the process, turns to gas again. And so in that phase change process, going from liquid to gas and back, you're losing a lot of your energy in the form of heat, and that's what really does the cooling. So to get the most benefit out of that, it's got to be a longer heat pipe, and running across the card this way is obviously going to give you a bigger heat pipe than up and down. So if you go across the card, can't really have horizontal fins as well. It would expose to the front case fans better, but those are doing such little work compared to the fans on the card anyway. Perhaps with a passive card, maybe like a really low end passive card with no heat pipes or something, maybe that makes sense. I could definitely see that making sense in a small form factor case or something, but that's just putting a lot of requirements at that point. getting really niche. But other than that, let's see if I had any notes from VSG. So VSG told me, for his own take on it, he says it's the same as for liquid radiators. The heat pipe and coolant tube has to be on the longer side of things to allow for as big of a delta temperature as possible, so fins are stacked perpendicular and sometimes in columns and rows if there's room for more than one set of heat pipe or coolant tubes. You want to give the best option possible for the coolant medium so that it will do more work. In this case, it would be the phase changer in the heat pipe. If you have longer fins, that's also more solder points, and logistics of making more fins versus more heat pipes also comes into play. The solder points are among the weakest point of transfer in an air cooler like this. It's typically tin. There are other types of solder though, and I haven't really followed up with any manufacturers on when they use tin versus something else. So that's something we can dig into more if people are interested. But yeah, that's your weakest point of contact, and then I think everything else has pretty much been said at this point. So that's most of it. Very good question though. I think we can count that as answered for now, but if anyone has add-ons to that question, let me know, or if you're just interested in air cooling parts in general. We also asked the EVGA about the heat pipes, and they had a pretty good point here. They noted that for the heat sinks, they want the shortest distance for the hot air to be exhausted, so that's accounting for the fans on the top, making sure that when they blow air down into the card, it needs to have a clear path to get out of the card, and having longitudinal fins would stretch that out and make it take longer for the air to get out of the way. So that was a good point as well. Next question is from 10 teraflop APU barrier, who said, ask GN, sorry if this has been asked before. When benching the performance of a baseline GPU Boost 3.0 enabled card, is it fair, or should these cards have their boost clocks locked to the manufacturer's specified boost? Maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but it would seem that you could see exaggerated performance gains as now a stock card is effectively being thrown against an overclocked one. So to be fair, the stock card is also technically overclocking per boost spec. The boost number that Nvidia gives in this instance, because we're talking about Boost 3.0, that's their thing. The boost number they give is not normally what you're actually running at. It tends to be higher if there's thermal and power headroom. It'll be lower. That's the reason there's a base and a boost. It can be lower than boost under the bad power or thermal conditions that may be encountered on the card. It should not ever be lower than base. That's the actual clock specification, unless you lower your power target. But to answer the question, should you basically normalize cards? You can definitely lock the clocks. It's not very reliable. It tends to be a little bit it's unstable too, like with K-Boost or something. So I don't really like doing that. But also, you have to realize that when you're reviewing a card anyway, the silicon variance GPU to GPU is the primary driver in differences in how well they overclock. It's good to have a strong VRM. It doesn't necessarily matter that much, because aside from a select few cards, like kingpin cards, there's really not a lot of binning that goes on. And binning is kind of a misnomer too, because even in that case, what they're really doing is just pre-selecting. So they're testing the chips, they find the good ones, and they put it on whatever the spec is for the card. So for example, I'm just using EVGA here because I know what they do. If you have something like an FTW3 high-end card, and then you might have a lower-end DT card in the same cooler design and same PCB, what they do is they'll run the cards, all of them, through testing when it's on the PCB, and pass or fail. If it passes, it becomes maybe the high-end FTW3. If it fails, it becomes the DT series with a lower specified boost clock. So the point of all that is to say that silicon quality varies a lot more than really anything else that the AIB partner can do for you, aside from the cooler quality. So when we're testing a card, what we're really testing in terms of its clock performance is, one, what's the quality of the silicon they used, which is not really part of the review, because that's basically random and it's controlled by Nvidia more than the board partners. The next part is how good is the cooling solution, and that's what really determines how the frequency will fluctuate from boost parameters that we're talking about here. So to normalize these at a fixed frequency or something like that would really be taking away the advantage of a better cooling solution or power delivery or whatever it may be that establishes the real differences in the cards. And ultimately, again, silicon variance per Nvidia's manufacturing run will vary more than really anything else anyway. But yeah, it's a good question. From a pure, if you're trying to collect really pure data, it could be interesting, but you'd have to have a big sample size to have any confidence in it. And ultimately, we are testing the entire package, the whole card. So to do that properly does require not really messing with those things for a stock baseline test, because you are trying to see how much headroom does that cooler give you for its clocks anyway. But yeah, that's I think that's kind of most. There's a lot more to say on this one. I've said it a lot in the past too in GPU reviews, but boost makes things difficult and silicon quality tolerances make things difficult. So that's why when we're reviewing, for example, a bunch of 1080 Ti's or 1070 Ti's, after the first one or two, all the FPS testing stops, because it's going to be the same. It's going to be the same plus or minus silicon quality differences. If I line up 10 1070 Ti's here, Asus, EVGA, Gigabyte, everybody, the differences between them in terms of gaming performance, unless one has a really bad cooler, those differences will amount to silicon quality. If you put an air cooler like some Aero card on there, that would be worth testing, because then your cooling performance is going to be so bad that you could actually have a clock deficit. So that's kind of my parameters for testing. For reviews, we mostly focus on thermals and things like that anyway. Next question is from David Watson, who said, I think it's from YouTube, Steve, this has been driving me insane. Why the hell are manufacturers still using toothpaste compound for their CPUs when we all know that by using liquid metal, you are dropping the temperatures from anywhere between 8 and 20 degrees? Why haven't they cottoned up? I think that's supposed to say, why haven't they caught on to this obvious and glaring fact by now? Surely they realize the temperature drop will only significantly enhance the lifespan of CPUs and make it superior product. It's insanity. I've talked about this in the past too. I think it was with maybe the 7980XE review or one of those. But first of all, liquid metal is not really a great compound to use. What you would use instead is solder. That's what AMD uses on their Ryzen CPUs, and Intel has used it in the past on some of their high-end desktop. And even before that, I want to say Sandy Bridge. Off the top of my head, I think some Sandy Bridge CPUs used solder as well. That would be your alternative to liquid metal. It'll be a bit better. It's better logistically because you don't have to worry about like cracking or just kind of moving around and things like that. Aging. Solder is going to be a better solution. Now, why don't they do it? Well, liquid metal is too expensive and it's impractical. Solder, I don't have a great answer for you. I've tried to get one for years, and it's come down to a few things. I have a few theories on this now. So for the reason why doesn't Intel use solder on their CPUs, you could say costs a bit more than doing thermal paste. You could say durability. Intel has argued that the smaller dies have potential problems with solder where they could crack over time or develop microfractures. There's not a great way to validate that. However, you could point to any number of millions of Sandy Bridge CPUs and other CPUs that did use solder and were small dies and did not have microfractures. The larger dies, that argument does not apply. So the high core count CPUs, there's no real argument there. And potentially you could start arguing things like, well, maybe there's a conflict-free side of things. Intel does that conflict-free marketing. I don't know if there are any government grants or anything like that, but using thermal paste from a conflict-free factory or whatever it may be, or source or supplier, I don't know if that gives them any kind of incentive in terms of money to do that, whereas sourcing solder without being hyper expensive may interfere with that. I don't know if the going green side of things is part of it as well. I've heard that kind of rumored as also with this. So I don't have a good answer why Intel doesn't use solder. I have asked them. I have asked every PR rep that's worked there in the last several years. I've spoken about it with Der Bauer a lot, and we've kind of hypothesized things on this channel actually about why that may be the case. But anyway, so liquid metal is not a great solution. Solder would be good. There are ups and downs. I would like to point out here that despite some of the rhetoric, Intel CPUs lately have actually improved. The high core count thermal paste is different than what the 7700K used, as far as I'm aware, and its thermal performance is better. And also, at that same base is used on the 8700K, and overclocking them within reason is really not that bad. Now, if you want maximum overclock performance, you do have to basically delid it, because it's just, you're going to run out of thermal headroom. But they do operate pretty reasonably with the stock compounds. The biggest problem with these high core count compound CPUs is not the thermal paste, it's the motherboard vendors blasting really high auto voltages to them, to the point where, as we've reported in the past, you get 7700Ks operating basically stock at 90 degrees Celsius. Then you go in and manually drop the voltage to something that's perfectly stable and much lower, and you could be at 60, 70 degrees Celsius with a 280 millimeter cooler at max fan speed. So a lot of it's the voltages. I will certainly not argue that that solder would be better, but at the same time, liquid metal is not the ideal solution. I think that addresses pretty much everything I know about the issue from what Intel's told me or not told me and what I've spoken with other people about. But next question is from Salad, who said, in your recent delidding and liquid metal video, your recommendation for preventing liquid metal overflow or spillage from getting on the CPU contacts was to use nail polish. In Optimum Tech's recent delidding liquid metal video, he recommends using silicone sealant, the same that you use on the IHS in this video. Is there any reason why you would not recommend simply using the silicone sealant to protect the contacts? Why didn't you just use your silicone sealant that you had on hand instead of nail polish? A couple reasons for that one. So the main one here is removability. Silicone sealant, you have to basically pick it off to get rid of it. And there's a really good chance that you're going to rip off a surface mount device when you do that. Those capacitors are exceedingly fragile, and you get away with ripping one of them off, but you don't want to do much more than that. The resistors and other things on there, it's not worth it. Because if it's ever coming apart again, you should just use nail polish, because you can remove it with acetone if you need to. It's got a low profile. It lays perfectly around the surface of the device. You can still see the device. It doesn't create any kind of Z height between the PCB and the IHS. And again, it's easy to remove. Whereas silicone adhesive, if you have to remove it because maybe your liquid metal application has aged or you didn't apply it very well the first time, which happens, if you have to remove it, there's more risk in damaging the parts if for some reason something goes wrong. So that's my primary reason. And also, it's just super easy to remove nail polish, and it does basically the same thing. So that's really all there is to that. Also, I hate working with silicone adhesive. It kind of sucks to work with. But next question is from, I don't write down who asked this one. It was in the askgn-questions channel in Discord for Patreon members. GN staff, Nvidia, Ampere, and Ampere Computing, unfortunate naming coincidence. I think that the name that people think the next generation architecture is going to be called might be incorrect. But I'll leave that there. It might be a code name or something. We'll see if it actually ends up being the public name, but I don't think it will be. Next question is from smwebhead, smwebhead. Thank you for the difficult name. Stupid question. I finally received new 1080 FTW if installed in the top 16 PCIe slot. It's a bit close to the CPU cooler. I watched the video that you did regarding performance in 16 versus 8 lanes. Would it be stupid to use the 8 lane to gain distance from the GPU and the air cooler? This would be on my old and moldy but still rock solid Gigabyte Z77 motherboard. Appreciate the input. I think it's fine. It's pretty straightforward. PCIe Gen 3, I think that might be I don't know. I think that's still Gen 3, right? If it's, either way, it doesn't really matter. Gen 2 or Gen 3, 16 versus 8, if there's a difference, it's gonna be like 1%. So yeah, if that's what you have to do to make sure it's got some distance and the CPU cooler is not gonna short the card, then just go with that. I didn't look up your motherboard. Some boards do have by 16 slots lower down on the board. Like a lot of the time you'll have, you know, a by 16 up here and a by 8 and then maybe another by 16 right there. So check and see if that's the case. It doesn't hurt to use 16 if you can, but I also don't think it's going to hurt to use 8. Next question, Vegan64. says, or vegan 64, I guess in this case, says, with all your research, how much data did you produce in 2017 in gigabytes? I don't have an actual number on that for the data collection from testing. I have a number on it for media production, things like that, and it gets complicated because we compress our video files sort of once they've reached a certain age point, but we keep them around. It's fairly lossless, and we also delete our A-roll files once they're rendered into a video. So it would be a lot more, but as of today, I think we've used about 10 terabytes in the last year or so, and then just reduced that by about a terabyte today by running one of our scripts. So we can control it pretty well. Using the compression scripts and getting rid of stuff that we definitely don't need anymore has allowed us to keep the same set of hard drives for years at this point, rather than just adding on infinitely more and more hard drives. It's a lot of cost involved in that, a lot of maintenance, things like that. So just easier to organize stuff, get rid of what we definitely don't need, and then compress everything else. Test data definitely is in the hundreds of gigabytes. If you start counting the captured videos for things like VR and console benchmarking, it's even more hundreds of gigabytes, getting into terabytes range for the last year, but we do try and compress those as well. Got a couple more here that are quick. Street Guru, I finally remembered what happened to the Radeon SSG. Could the effective 1 terabyte of VRAM be good for miners? Did they realize that 10 people with red wasn't going to be enough of a customer base? So the Radeon SSG is available. You can buy it on B&H Photo and a couple other places. It's like $7,000. It targets a professional market. I don't know what kind of sales volume they have, but it's out there and you can buy it. The bigger part of the question, though, and I think we can all agree the more important one, is how does it do for mining? Well, given the current GPU shortage and the mining demand for cards, I would like to think that if I say the card's very good at mining, they'll all go buy the $7,000 card and leave the other ones alone. So we'll just pretend that's the case. But in reality, so I did actually talk to some people about this question. So I thought it was kind of a funny one to bring up. So despite having 1 terabyte of VRAM, and please, if you know a lot about crypto mining, let me know below what you think. But I talked to some people, and from what I understand, crypto mining is more bandwidth intensive than it is capacity intensive. I don't know if there are any algorithms where that's not the case while they also remain profitable on a $7,000 card. But if they are not capacity intensive, then in fact, SSD storage will be lower bandwidth than the 16 gigabytes of HBM2 that's on the card. And at that point, you might as well buy Vega Frontier or 64 or whatever if you're really doing mining and looking for bandwidth, because I think it'd probably be about the same or better, especially for the $7,000 price. Although the GTX 1080 Ti will soon be priced at that same level. So anyway, if you know where the capacity might come into play with mining, let us know in the comments. I'm just kind of curious at this point. Last one. Not Twist said, an EVGA tech suggested I should remove the cooler off my 1070 Ti, remove all the thermal pads, and replace them with an actual thermal compound. Is this a bad idea? Yes, it is most certainly a bad idea. And I'm sure that's just a one-off instance, but don't do that. Thermal pads are there because they're thicker, they're not runny, they don't really age the same way. It will sit there always as a gap to bridge the gap between the components. And thermal paste is not there specifically because it probably isn't a good application. So I would say if you have to replace them, then buy more thermal pads and replace it with those. I don't know what the technician was thinking. But last one, we had some fan art from someone. I'll put that on the screen for a second. And that's it for this time. Thank you for watching. You can subscribe for more. As always, go to patreon.com/gamersnexus so you can get the second part of this Ask GN. It'll just be a couple more questions. We'll probably do that more frequently in the near future. So, as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.